Before I tell you what happened, I want you to picture something. Imagine working 60 hours a week, staying late every single night, skipping lunches, missing family dinners, sacrificing weekends, covering for everyone on your team. Not because you had to, but because you actually cared about the work. You cared about doing things right. And then, after all of that, imagine having your boss stand up in front of the entire office and call you incompetent, lazy, replaceable. Not in a private meeting room, not in a quiet corner where at least you could keep your dignity. Right there, in the wide open office, in front of every single colleague you had spent 3 years building relationships with. Every person who respected you, every person whose opinion mattered to you. That happened to me. And in that moment, sitting there with my face burning and 14 pairs of eyes staring at me, I made a decision. Not a loud decision, not an angry one. A quiet one, a cold one. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have possibly predicted, was that I had already been quietly building something. And that humiliation she handed me that Thursday afternoon, it didn't break me. It was the last piece I needed. This is my story. Stay with me until the very end, because I promise you, the way this plays out is something you will not see coming. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the job. I had been working at a mid-sized marketing firm for 3 years when Sandra was brought in as our new department head. From the very first day, she walked through that door. Perfectly pressed blazer, perfectly rehearsed smile, perfectly calculated handshake. Something felt off. I couldn't name it immediately. It was just a feeling, the kind your gut sends you before your brain catches up. Something behind her eyes that didn't match the warmth she performed for the room. But I pushed that feeling aside. New management is always an adjustment. People deserve a chance. I told myself to be patient, work hard, show her what I was capable of, let the results speak. So that is exactly what I did. I took on extra projects without being asked. I volunteered for the tasks everyone else avoided. I stayed until 9 p.m. on nights when my colleagues had left by 5. I went above and beyond on every brief, every campaign, every client report. Not to impress Sandra specifically, but because that was simply how I worked. It was who I was. And for the first couple of months, she seemed pleased. She would nod at my contributions in meetings. Occasionally, she would say something vague, like, "Good work on that," in passing. Nothing specific. Nothing that acknowledged the actual hours I had put in. But I told myself that was fine. Some managers lead differently. Then I started noticing something. The first time it happened, I told myself I had imagined it. Sandra had presented a content strategy to the senior leadership team. A strategy that was, word for word, the framework I had submitted to her 2 weeks earlier in a detailed document. My name was not mentioned once during the presentation. I told myself maybe she had developed similar ideas independently. Coincidences happen. The second time it happened, I felt something tighten in my chest. Another presentation. Another set of ideas pulled directly from a report I had written. Again, no credit. Again, just Sandra standing at the front of the room collecting praise that belonged to someone else. The third time, I knew. She stood in that boardroom and presented an entire campaign I had spent 3 weeks developing. 3 weeks of late nights, research, competitor analysis, creative direction, all of it. She delivered it with the confidence of someone presenting their own original thinking. And when the CEO said, "Sandra, this is brilliant," she smiled and said thank you. I sat at that table and kept my face completely neutral. But inside, something had shifted. Something had gone very still and very focused. She was using me. And she had absolutely no idea what kind of person she had chosen to use. The moment that changed everything happened on a Thursday afternoon in March. And I want to describe it carefully because I want you to understand exactly what kind of person Sandra was. We had just come out of a difficult client presentation. The client had raised serious concerns about our project timeline. Specifically, that several key deliverables were running 2 weeks behind schedule. The tension in the room had been thick. The client was not happy. Leadership was not happy. And everyone was looking for an explanation. Now here is what actually happened. Sandra had unilaterally changed the internal deadline 3 weeks earlier without notifying the project team. I had the email chain to prove it. The delay was a direct consequence of her decision. A decision made without consultation and never properly communicated downstream. But Sandra had no interest in the truth. She gathered all 14 members of our team in the open office. Not a conference room. Not somewhere private. Right there in the middle of the floor, where every passing colleague, every person from other departments, every intern could see and hear everything. And she began. She went around the team one by one, dissecting what she called our individual failures. She exaggerated. She twisted timelines. She reframed her own decisions as our mistakes. It was a performance, calculated, deliberate, designed to protect herself by dismantling everyone around her. And then she got to me. She said I was the weakest link on the team, that my work had been consistently below the standard she expected, that she had been quietly covering for my underperformance for months, and that she was exhausted by it, that if things did not change dramatically, she would have no choice but to escalate. Every word landed like something physical. I sat completely still, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, face burning, hands flat on my thighs under the table so no one could see them. 14 people were looking at me, some with pity, some with relief that they weren't the one being targeted, some clearly uncomfortable and staring at the floor. I did not speak. I did not defend myself. I did not react. Not because I was afraid, not because she was right, but because in that moment something inside me became very, very calm. A quiet voice that cut through the humiliation and the anger and said, "Do not give her the reaction she wants. Take notes, take everything she just handed you, and use it." I looked at Sandra once, directly, held her gaze for just a moment. Then I looked back down at my notebook and wrote the date. Before I tell you what happened next, if you are new here and you are enjoying this story, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button right now. I post stories like this every single week, stories of people who were underestimated, overlooked, and pushed to their limit, and what they did about it. You do not want to miss what is coming. And if this story is already hitting home for you, drop a like. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps this channel reach more people who need to hear these kinds of stories. All right, back to Sandra. Because what happened next is where things get really interesting. That evening I went home, sat down at my personal laptop, and opened a new folder. I named it simply Evidence. I want you to understand the mindset I was in. I was not emotional. I was not spiraling. I had moved past the anger somewhere on the commute home and arrived at something much more useful: clarity. Cold, focused, strategic clarity. I started from the very beginning. I went back through every email, every document, every submission I had made over the past 18 months, and I began to build a timeline. Every instance where I had submitted work that later appeared in Sandra's presentations, with dates, with the original documents attached, with the presentation files saved alongside them. Every Slack message where she had given me verbal direction and then denied it when the outcome wasn't perfect. Every meeting note where credit had been redirected. Every performance review comment that contradicted the paper trail. I organized it chronologically, methodically, the way you would build a legal case, because that is exactly what it was becoming. If you are watching this right now and you are in a difficult work situation, I want you to hear this clearly. Document everything. Every email, keep it. Every important conversation, follow it up in writing. Screenshot your messages. Save your files with timestamps. You may never need it. But if you do need it, you will be so grateful you have it. I cannot stress this enough. Now, while I was building my own file, I started doing something else. Something I had to approach very carefully. I began quietly reaching out to a few colleagues. Not to gossip, not to vent, just to check in. Asking how they were finding things. Listening more than talking. And what I found was that I was not alone. One colleague, someone who had been at the company longer than anyone else on the team, told me that Sandra had presented her research to the board 6 months earlier without a single mention of her name. She had been too scared to say anything. Another told me he had been formally written up for a project failure that had resulted directly from Sandra overriding his recommendation and making a call that backfired. The write-up was still on his record. And then there was the promotion. A senior position had opened up 8 months ago. 3 people on the team had been told they were strong candidates, myself included. The role went to someone who, by every measurable metric, was less qualified than the other candidates. Someone who, it turned out, had a personal friendship with Sandra outside the office. A friendship that predated Sandra's hiring. We were not just carrying individual grievances. We were all carrying pieces of the same story. And for the first time, those pieces were starting to connect. It took me 6 weeks to compile everything properly. 6 weeks of showing up every single morning with a completely neutral expression. 6 weeks of responding to Sandra's emails professionally and promptly. 6 weeks of attending her meetings, contributing my work, giving her absolutely nothing that could be used against me. While underneath all of that, I was building something she had no idea was coming. Around week 3, I did something I had never done before. I consulted an employment lawyer, just an initial consultation, just to understand my options and whether what I had documented was as significant as I believed it to be. What she told me was more validating than I expected. The systematic pattern of intellectual theft, taking credit for subordinates' work repeatedly and provably, was not just unethical. Depending on how it was handled internally, it could carry real professional and legal consequences. The hostile work environment she had created. The promotion that appeared to have been awarded based on personal relationship rather than merit. These were not small things. But I did not want to go the legal route. Not as a first move. Legal action is slow, expensive, and unpredictable. I wanted something faster, something cleaner, something that would let the evidence simply speak for itself to the people who had the power to act on it immediately. So I wrote a report, not an angry letter, not a complaint full of emotion, a formal, structured, professionally written document, 12 pages, chronological, every claim supported by attached evidence, every allegation stated plainly and factually without exaggeration or editorializing. I described the pattern of misconduct over 18 months. I attached the documents. I included the timelines. I presented it the same way I would present a campaign strategy, clearly, logically, with everything the reader needed to reach their own conclusion. And then I made a very deliberate choice about where to send it. Not to HR. Sandra had cultivated relationships in that department. I had no way of knowing how that report would be handled, or whether it would quietly disappear. Instead, I sent it directly to the CEO's office, marked confidential, addressed personally, with a cover letter that was 3 paragraphs long, calm, professional, and utterly devastating in what it laid out. I informed my 2 colleagues what I had done, not to pressure them, just so they knew. Within the following week, both of them independently submitted their own formal accounts to the same office. 3 separate voices, 3 separate paper trails, all telling the same story. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of complete silence from leadership. 3 weeks of going about my day wondering whether anything was happening, whether the report had been read, whether it had made any difference at all. And then on a Tuesday afternoon, Sandra was called into a meeting, not a regular meeting, a meeting with the CEO and 2 members of the board, a meeting that none of us had been told about in advance, a meeting that her assistant looked visibly uncomfortable about when Sandra asked what it was regarding. I watched her walk into that conference room, composed, professional, the mask fully on. I watched her walk out 40 minutes later a completely different person. The composure was gone. The carefully constructed confidence, gone. She walked back to her desk with the expression of someone who had just watched the floor drop out from beneath them. She sat down. She made a phone call very quietly, turned slightly away from the room, and then she opened her desk drawer and took out a bag. By 4 p.m., her desk was empty. We were informed the following morning that Sandra had resigned to pursue other opportunities. That was the entire official statement. No elaboration, no farewell. She was simply gone. The campaign I had developed, the one she had presented to the CEO as her own brilliant thinking 4 months earlier, was referenced in the company newsletter 3 weeks later, with my name on it, acknowledged directly by the CEO as an example of strong internal talent. And the promotion I had been passed over for? I received an email about it 6 weeks after Sandra left. I started the role the following month. Here is what I want you to take away from this. Sandra was not just a difficult manager. She was someone who had built an entire career on a system, a very deliberate, very calculated system of extracting value from the people beneath her and converting it into personal advancement. And it had worked for her. Probably for years. Probably at multiple companies before ours, because most people she targeted either didn't document what was happening, didn't believe anyone would listen, or were simply too worn down to fight back. The mistake she made with me was a simple one. She mistook my patience for passivity. She mistook my professionalism for compliance. She mistook my silence in that open office, while she stood there dismantling me in front of everyone, for defeat. It was none of those things. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who is in a situation that feels impossible right now. Who is being underestimated, overlooked, or deliberately undermined by someone with more power than you? Who has been made to feel small by someone who should have been protecting and developing you instead? Stay calm. Stay professional. Keep your emotions out of the paper trail and put your evidence in it instead. Because justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is not a confrontation or a dramatic moment. Sometimes it is just a 12-page document, sent quietly, to the right person, at exactly the right time. If this story meant something to you today, please give it a like. It genuinely helps this channel grow and reach people who need to hear these stories. And if you are not part of this community yet, subscribe now. Every week I bring you real stories of people who refused to stay down, who played the long game, who let patience and preparation do what anger never could. I will see you in the next one.